Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Paris, and I want to talk about ethics and utilitarianism today. There are many different key aspects of ethics that are important to consider, but utilitarianism is very foundational for thinking about other ethical frameworks, and it is a good idea to pair utilitarianism with other things. So, we're going to talk a little bit about ethics in dialogue. First of all, we ask the question, does ethics concern all customs and practices of people? And the answer to that is ethics deals with morally significant human actions. And this is where we left off previously. So it's not just anything that people are doing, but those that have moral significance. And of course, many things can have moral significance that we don't always think about. We can ask another question to say, well, what does make something morally significant? The answer is your common sense intuition helps distinguish between moral and non-moral statements. And in many cases, that's pretty easy to do. But it's become more and more difficult to think about, an issue that might be ethical or not ethical. Just for example, think about either with your spouse, your partner, or a friend group, you're deciding to go out to eat where you go out to eat. If there's a vegetarian in the group, then that is an ethical issue. Some people in the group may be concerned about, well, what are the practices at this restaurant and various ideas like that all of a sudden can become morally significant, even though we're generally not thinking about what we choose to eat. It's always morally significant, but it can take on that depending on who's a member of the dinner party and what you're going to do and what restaurant that you might choose. And maybe someone's heard something negative about that restaurant on an ethical basis. For example, where I live, there was a restaurant that got very popular, and then some people found out that the restaurant owners were trafficking people into work at the restaurant. Now, eating at that buffet did not seem like a big deal at all until that happened, and then people started to ask ethical questions about it. But to move our focus now to utilitarianism, one of the great things about studying ethics is that we can find small phrases to remember what ethics is, or ethical framework. So utilitarianism is what Mr. Spock says in Star Trek: the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. The idea in Star Trek was that the Vulcan homeworld was very violent, but logic saved the people, and they needed to be concerned about the greater good. And that's not a bad way to approach ethics, but of course, we might ask ourselves some questions about, for example, how does that affect minorities if, the needs of the many, well, the needs of the many might leave out some other people. So utilitarianism, even though it sounds good and it's extremely logical, may not be the perfect ethical system, but it's not a bad one. It has a lot of good characteristics. And we're going to talk about how utilitarianism came to be. It's associated with Jeremy Bentham, who lived 1748 to 1832. He's Oxford educated. He had a brief legal career, focused on morals and legislation, and his focus areas were utilitarianism and economics. And you can see some of the connections between those two things. So the underlying parts of utilitarianism are consequentialism. We're going to ask ourselves about this. It means what makes an action or policy morally right depends entirely on the consequences the action or policy brings about. What is the ends? Do the ends justify the means? And then hedonism, the only kind of thing that is inherently good is pleasure or happiness, kind of that idea of eat, drink, and be merry. For tomorrow we all die. If you put consequentialism and hedonism together, you get utilitarianism. So they're trying to balance each other out. Hedonism is going a little too far in one direction, but consequentialism is asking about the consequences of something, and hedonism is like, well, the greatest pleasure or happiness. Well, how do we make the most people happy? Then we have utilitarianism. You can see how that all works together. So the definition of utilitarianism is what makes an action or policy morally right depends entirely on whether or not the consequence brings about the greatest utility. In just basic terms, does it bring about the greatest good for the greatest number would be the question to consider. So how do we calculate utility? So the impartiality requirement, no one's happiness counts more than someone else's. So that brings a little bit of equality into utilitarianism. And then the universality requirement, everyone whose happiness is affected must be counted. So it has to come into consideration. Of course, once again, what if we have a large number of people who seem to be happy about something? Do we go with that? Or what if there are some that are going to be negatively affected by this? We would ask that question as well. Utilitarianism is often seen in just war and in business. So someone might say, for the greater good, we need to drop this bomb here, and this is what should be done. For the greater good, we need to prevent this country from getting nuclear weapons. And so utilitarianism uh, can be argued there, but that does not consider the people who live there and the governments that there, and whether there are weapons of mass destruction that need to be stopped. Can people manipulate utilitarianism and make it sound good when really all the facts aren't there? And then in business as well, we might have a company that is maybe on the potential, the brink of going out of business, and the CEO says, you know what, if we will cut 20% of the workforce, then the company can survive. There might be another plan that says if everyone will take a pay cut, then we can keep the company going and everyone can keep their jobs. And that can be a difficult situation that it would be for the greater good. But some people might say, well, but I've been here longer and I just bought a new car or truck or a new house and I really need my complete paycheck. And other people might be like, no, I care about my coworkers and I want to make sure this happens. And of course, businesses can a lot of times justify things by the greater good in saying, oh, well, we can't do this or that, and yet only a few are benefiting, maybe the people at the top. And that can be a question of whether utilitarianism is really working and what people will do. Utilitarianism, here's the opposite view that we've kind of been hinting at a lot, where the few don't matter until you're one of them and suddenly change your mind. So if you're on board with the greater good and you're part of the group that has experienced what is seen as the greater good, but then you're left out, you might feel differently about that. That's why we talked about the opinions of minorities and how they are affected by the situation, and that this can, not be good, and maybe not everyone is considered. Utilitarianism, surgeon on a time limit. You seem a decent fellow. I hate to kill you. Man with healthy organs. You seem a decent fellow. I hate to die. This is referring to a interesting utilitarian argument. Say that we are in a hospital and we have some patients. They need a lung, a heart, a kidney, and a liver. You have a completely healthy patient. Well, the greater good would say you should take all the organs from that patient and give it to the ones who need it. But I don't think most people would make that decision, and that is why utilitarianism doesn't always work. It does remind me, though, of the movie 7 Pounds that Will Smith starred in, where he wanted to give away his organs. So you might think about that movie and how that plays out. Another example is the Ford Pinto. The problem is it had a deadly fuel tank. What does Ford do? Is he going to do that? Well, Ford reasoned human life will be worth $200,000, which is terrible to try to put a value on human life because it's worth so much more. And Ford reasoned that it was better to pay for lawsuits than the $11 per car to make the repair. So Ford is making a business decision, but not really the best one. And it's not really for the greater good if you're the one whose fuel tank explodes, and it's just playing with fire literally to see if that will happen. So if there are any questions or comments about utilitarianism, please let me know. Again, it is the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, or the one. It is focusing on the greater good and looking at the ends of actions of what creates the greatest happiness. But some of the negatives are, well, what about minorities, and who is not being considered in the grand calculation of utilitarianism? So as we think about utilitarianism, I encourage you to look at other frameworks and say, well, what could I put with utilitarianism to kind of balance it out? Till next time, this is Dr. Paris signing off.